So, my original plans for a video this week fell through, and strangely enough, the first piece of tech that I actually felt like investigating was the Game Boy Color, and just what was going on inside. So this right here is the Game Boy Color, which was released in the great year of 1998, 21 years ago, utilising the Sharp LR35902, which was a hybrid between the Intel 8080 and the Z-Log Z80. It clocks in at a blistering 8.38 MHz, which may not sound like much, but that was double the clock speed of the original Game Boy, which also used the same CPU. It can slow down for compatibility reasons with this actually. It also has 16 kilobytes of VRAM, 32 kilobytes of normal RAM, which is 4 times as much as the original Game Boy once again, and for everything this little beast could be doing, it can render it to a screen. And a colour screen of all things, which was one of the main draws of the Game Boy Color. Admittedly, 21 years ago it was a bit more impressive with a 160 by 144 15-bit RGB TFT screen, so once you get past all the acronyms, it's actually a solid little display for what it is, but suffers with the inevitable issue of having no backlight and being borderline impossible to see most of the time. It did, however, have some neat tricks, like being able to render 512 tiles, but only showing up to 399, allowing for some smooth scrolling in all directions, a sort of off-screen buffer that's still being rendered, so when you approach it, it's already able to show you it. It could also display 56 colours on screen at a time, but could also pull off a very impressive high colour mode, which was done in a few titles, and was very, very impressive considering the hardware on display. It could actually do 2,000 colours. But anyway, the results could vary, but we'll get into that a little bit later on. But with all of that tech gibberish out of the way, how powerful really was it? Well, there are modern calculators that can run a lot of the Game Boy Color games perfectly fine. In fact, most of the time it could actually run them a lot better than the original Game Boy Color. In fact, for the time it was criticised for being weaker than the Game Gear. Which might not sound like much, but remember, that came out 8 years earlier than this. However, if there was something we know about developers, specifically those with ties to Nintendo, with enough time, with a device, and a certain architecture, they can pull off things through sheer feats of optimization, which is exactly what the Game Boy Color saw, because for 10 years prior to this, Nintendo developers had been developing for the original Game Boy, which had the exact same setup with less RAM and slower clocks. So for near on a decade, they already had experience with how to use this equipment. So with a set of boosted clocks and some more RAM, just what did they pull off on this kind of hardware? So for this I am probably going to be showing you some direct recordings of what they managed to do, and I'm also going to blow it up onto a CRT, because some of these games really do shine when they're blown up onto the big picture. That, and I really doubt some of you want to see a bloke fiddle around with a tiny little portable screen trying to show you what the games look like. That can be a spin-off video if that's really what you came here to see, but either way, what exactly did they manage to pull off? Well, first up on my list, I thought I would start off with a title that comes off stupidly impressive in its own right, but makes for an even better comparison with the original Game Boy version of the game with Zelda Link's Awakening, an already extremely impressive title for that original Game Boy. But when given more power and a coloured screen and a new lick of paint, well, I don't think I need to be the one to tell you that what they pulled off looks so impressive it could definitely pass for a console game from the early 90s. It fully utilises the off-screen buffer for its scrolling from screen to screen, something that does look very nice in motion considering what the developers were working with. Another crazily impressive RPG-like title was the likes of Dragon Quest III, which released as one of the later titles on the console. However, the huge scope of the game, quality of the sprites, and most of all, the level of animation they got away with on this little console are damn near insane. All in all, a very interesting display of the console's power with a smooth scrolling overworld, which seems stupid to praise for a game from 2001, but given the lack of power at their disposal, it is really impressive. If you're into RPGs, this game's utterly brilliant, and then again, the system really does have no shortage of them, so that's kind of an advert in itself. Next up is a bit of an interesting one with Oddworld Adventures 2, which is a surprisingly well done game considering that it doesn't really get any coverage whatsoever. For what it's actually worth, the modern titles of the era came out on the PlayStation line of consoles, so it's rather strange that the mobile ports eagerly came to Nintendo's portables. The competition. But where the game lacks in certain areas, it does actually make up for it with its beautifully animated sprites, a fairly comprehensive conversion of the PlayStation 1 experience, which is only really let down by its password level loading system. Something that is unfortunately common on this era of games. Whether or not it goes down to the developers or goes down to the device itself, you can decide yourself, as it is certainly a shortcoming of weaker hardware. Talking about smooth animations, another impressive feat in the platform area, of course, has to include Donkey Kong Country, which made its way onto the system and features not only impressive level design, but crazily impressive audio, which we'll touch on later on in the video, given it was developed by Rare. And it's not surprising that they were the ones to actually pull all this off. I will say that given the small resolution, it can make for some poor viewing, especially on the console itself, but when you blow up the game onto a CRT with its natural softness, well, personally I found it to be the best way to play the game, and it was very enjoyable. Now this one. This one is going to surprise you. This entire game features a full FMV cutscene intro, which uses that high resolution mode I mentioned earlier, and the cutscene is fully voiced with terrible audio, with a song that is almost as creepy and chilling as the actual intro. I mean, this actually is really weird, but the actual full game is covered in terms of full audio. It's very impressive considering what it is a pseudo 3D style menu which looks very impressive for the console. However, the main game is in 2D. It plays alright and is actually a fun game. However, I will say that, it's a bit lackluster considering that FMV intro you get. But still, the fact they pulled that off on a Game Boy Color is crazily impressive. Other honourable mentions go to the likes of the final Zelda games on the system, which is an expansion on the Zelda Link's Awakening formula, and co-developed by Capcom. Either way, an improvement all-round of an already impressive title, especially with its dynamic season system and all-around detailed environments. You've also got games developed by Rare like Perfect Dark, which run beautifully and feature a top-down view with full voice acting in certain instances and play very nicely on the system, which is no surprise considering that, as I said, it was a game by Rare. Other titles like Tetris run brilliantly, which is really a surprise. And then you've got lots of titles that build on this with the NES formula games like Metal Gear Solid, which is essentially the NES game but running on a portable console. It's a pain in the ass to see because these games were designed for a TV, however even on a TV it can be a little bit difficult to see, so you can imagine how difficult it is on the original Game Boy Color. Either way, I think that they actually managed to pull off a decent amount in the video department. But what other things were happening on the system? What was going on behind the scenes? Well, the console itself was fully backwards compatible with the Game Boy by essentially downclocking itself. It could, however, apply palettes to the games you were playing to spice them up a bit with a bit more colour, something that is actually relatively impressive for what it is, and does add a degree of replayability to some of those older classic titles from the Game Boy era, even if they could be a bit basic in some regards. Now, audio-wise, I did mention this a few times in the video, and it's not like the Game Boy was a powerhouse in any way. It was virtually the same as the original Game Boy in this area, other than of course you could use some more of your CPU power to maybe control a few more samples, but why don't we go through a few titles and see just what they pulled off. Here are a few of my favourite examples in what they've pulled off in terms of soundtrack, and just in terms of audio detailing. So, there we have it, some particularly impressive examples. The only other area to mention itself was the inclusion of actual hardware inside the cartridges, something that was not exclusive to the Game Boy Color in any way itself, but still something that's often associated with it. One of the most common and well-known examples is the inclusion of a clock system in Pokemon Gold, Silver and Crystal, all of which are really impressive, and they actually contribute themselves in the regards of being you know, able to tell the time and date and adapt the gameplay in real time. It was a nice feature of the era and something that you really only got in these portable consoles, because of course you could take them with you anywhere. You've also got the homebrew community, which has some impressive ports like Wolfenstein 3D, however that does end up beefing up the actual cartridge itself once again with a coprocessor built in. Still an impressive showing considering it is still utilising the Game Boy Color hardware in some way. So there we have it. It's not a long video, but hopefully it's quite thorough on how powerful the Game Boy Color was. I mean, I don't really specialise in portable consoles or anything really, but I thought it was worth taking a look at just to find out what was going on. And it's about as powerful as a 90s phone in some areas, and slightly more powerful than a NES in a lot of ways. So it's this weird mix between 90s and 80s technology that mostly benefited from developers knowing what they were doing and that increased clock speed. Which of course really did help out, because developers essentially got a turbo-boosted Game Boy, something they'd already been developing for near on a decade, given its backwards compatible nature, which I keep saying. It's a miracle that a lot of these things pulled off have aged well, and you know what? Blown up onto the big screen, they still do play surprisingly well in the 21st century. And of course, you could lose a few hours playing what could just be a mobile game on a CRT, as they have this charm to them that was actually, you know, effort put into a mobile game that sometimes we don't see nowadays. Either way, it wasn't really powerful at all, but developers were talented. Thank you very much for watching, and good night. So, it's been a bit of a strange week and I haven't really been in the area to actually make videos, but I managed to get this one done, so I hope it was enjoyable, even if it was a bit shorter and a bit rough in places. But if you want to see more like this, you can always like and subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next one.